Joining us now, Astra Taylor, co-founder of the Debt Collective. Astra, it's been, I think it's been a while. Maybe it may have been a year since we've talked to you. And we are all basically waiting right now for the Supreme Court to make a decision on the Biden administration's authority under the HEROES Act, and that's important to say, as to whether they can forgive any student debt. And I guess one of the other things we're waiting to hear about is the standing of the plaintiffs. But let's put that aside for a moment. What's your sense, I mean, if you have it, as to what the Supreme Court's going to do?
I mean, I have no faith in the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court is a corrupt and illegitimate institution at this point. I mean, they've occasionally surprised us, and there are issues with the case related to the standing question. So I think that's really key. I just want to say I so appreciate how you frame this question. The case before the Supreme Court is not about student debt relief writ large. It's about the specific procedure the Biden administration used to propose its debt relief plan. And you mentioned the HEROES Act. So this is really about one method of canceling debt. There are others on the table, and that's really important.
Okay, well, let's go through. I mean, let's just briefly walk through this. When we say they're doing it under the auspices of the HEROES Act, they are doing, the HEROES Act was passed in the wake of 9/11. It allowed essentially different government agencies to provide relief, regulatory, almost like administrative, I should say, relief, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And it can be applied in any type of situation. It was invoked by Trump in 2020 to use to create a moratorium on payments of debt, which is, it's debt relief in some form or another. I mean, interest rates slow or basically stop, are frozen. Interest accrual is frozen. You have a chance to go out and theoretically work more. So, I mean, and the government supposedly lost some money in this instance. So, and that existed it will exist up until September. And it will end in this instance because of the debt ceiling deal, but it would have ended anyways. Do you think, what is your assessment without knowing how the Supreme Court rules on this? Because they may not even invoke the question of it being under the auspices of the HEROES Act as to whether there's any opportunity. But were there other alternatives in which the Biden administration could have used? And what's your sense as to whether one was better than the other?
Yeah, so there are multiple mechanisms to cancel student debt. I think one thing we also need to really make clear is canceling student debt is not radical at all. It happens all the time, actually, through disability discharges or income-driven repayment plans or public service loan forgiveness. Now, those programs are broken and they often, are difficult for people to access. But debt cancellation happens. It happens frequently through the Higher Education Act, which is the, sort of foundational Higher Education Act, just like it sounds, that gives a broad authority to compromise and settle student debt. So that authority has been used to grant billions of dollars under the Biden administration for hundreds of thousands of borrowers. So debt cancellation is routine. So the Debt Collective likes to say that the government has a Swiss Army knife of tools. There are multiple tools that can be used to cancel student debt, and they are all legal. I think that's really important to say as well. The HEROES Act wasn't flawed. It was a perfectly appropriate legal authority to use. We were in an emergency. I would say we are still in an emergency. The COVID pandemic certainly was something that caused a massive expansion, a kind of emergency expansion of the welfare state. Debt relief was given to corporations and to people, wealthy people, through PPP loans. So the legality of debt cancellation has never been in question. In fact, one of the authors of the HEROES Act wrote and said, this is being used exactly as it was intended. The case is really baseless. It's a bad faith case brought about by Republicans, and there's a joint case being heard with it that is literally being bankrolled by dark money billionaires, the guy behind Home Depot, Bernie Marcus. So the problem was not that they used the wrong legal authority or a weaker legal authority. I want to make 2 points. One is they used the HEROES authority from what we can tell, and this is, I do not have a direct line to the Oval Office, but I think we can assume this with some certainty. What the administration liked about the HEROES authority is that it was tied to the pandemic. So they could give the veil of saying, well, this is an exceptional case. We will give you some student debt relief. If they'd used, for example, the Higher Education Act, well, that's this broad-based authority. So what's stopping them from doing it again or canceling all student debt, right?
Right.
It opens a can of worms in their minds that maybe they didn't want to go for. They wanted to really tie it to the pandemic.
Yeah, that reminds me a little of how the House essentially said, we're going to do the much more convoluted and Byzantine COBRA expansion as opposed to temporarily expanding
exactly
Medicaid or Medicare.
It's sort of neoliberal brain there. But the problem was, and I just throw this out really quickly, is the problem isn't the legal authority, it's that they moved too slow and they means tested. So they put an income cap, which for complex reasons necessitated that they put an application on the relief, but then they didn't have the application ready to go. They waited 51 days to put the application online and then slowly started to approve people, ultimately approving 16 million applications. Well, those were days that the Republicans were like, wow, this is amazing. Let's throw everything we can at the wall. And so there were tons of lawsuits. There weren't just these two, there were tons of lawsuits that were thrown out of court. But ultimately, these two cases that are being heard together at the Supreme Court were lined up with sympathetic right-wing judges, and they got fast-tracked up the chain.
All right, let me, and just one other thing I should say, I think the Biden administration would say, and I'm not in a position to assess this, and I think we need to hear what the Supreme Court rules, but the Biden administration would also say, Trump had just used the HEROES Act. We had been using the HEROES Act for 3 years with this authority. The difference between pause and forgive debt is just a matter of degree. It's not a question of a legal authority or not. You either have that authority or you don't. And I think they also thought it would be more of a slam dunk. But I also, I totally agree with Emma's sort of analogy. They wanted to make this a sort of a one-time thing and not have it brought up again. But this notion of like the I think that 50 days that you talk about, the amazing thing is that I think the administration was so afraid of doing this, and they had no idea of its political value to 45 million Americans. And so that's the difference. Is like they underestimated how popular it would be. And what you're saying, I think, is once the Republicans saw how popular it was going to be, they set out to stop it at all costs.
100%. And it's popular with a portion of the Republican base. I don't know if you all remember, but I think you're exactly right. They were caught off guard, even though advocates had been telling them forever that it was popular, and there was ample polling saying, wow, this is really popular with, mythic independents and even Republicans and, across the board with younger people, but older people like it as well. There were these sort of long clips on CNN, 10-minute long clips where they're like, we're at the farmer's market in rural Pennsylvania looking for some salt of the earth people who hate student debt relief. And, everyone they found was like, oh, I think it's a pretty good idea. Actually, the cost of college is outrageous. And, I think helping people is good, actually. So 100% that they underestimated it. They dragged their feet. And I loved Emma's use of the word Byzantine. I mean, it wasn't the most Byzantine application that they put online, but, why not just mire something up in bureaucracy, right? And that was the thing. We said very clearly, for the years of our organizing, do this automatically, do this immediately, do not impose applications. There's so much social science research that shows the minute you means test, welfare benefits, or you impose applications that actually they filter out the people who actually need the relief the most or are the most vulnerable, right? So it was a very illogical thing in the sense that it was there to ostensibly filter out 3% of student borrowers, those mythic rich student debtors who make over $125,000 a year, and but what you actually do is you lose the poorest by having that application in place. So it was a real, it was really cutting off their own nose to spite the face. What is the phrase? Well,
it's also from a cost perspective. From a cost perspective, at best, it's a wash. It could have even been a loss to impose the means test to filter out such a small portion of people who would supersede it. The savings that you're going to get for not, providing $10,000 worth of relief, because almost definitely, not quite. I mean, it's conceivable you could have gotten a Pell Grant and be within that 3% as well. $10,000-$20,000 for a very small number of people. You're costing yourself that in the administration of it. I want to just note two other things in this conversation. Then I want to talk about like what's happening in terms of strategy, assuming the Supreme Court. There were two Congress contemplated in the American Rescue Act, the idea that debt relief would not be considered taxable benefit, which is an indication, it seems to me, that Congress specifically was okay with the exercise and assumed the authority existed. Otherwise, why would you include that provision? It would be silly. And we also know that Congress tried to stop debt relief and under Republican controlled House, and it didn't happen. So we have a sense. I think it's important to say this. Just if Supreme Court says that the administration doesn't have this authority, that Congress needs to legislate it. The Congress thought that the administration had this authority.
Really well said. I mean, so one of the there's many things that are really wrong with this case. So one is the way it was fast tracked up the chain. So there was never any discovery or fact finding. So when we think about lawsuits and court cases, right, we imagine people debating the evidence, or even bringing the evidence out. None of that happened in this case. The claims that were made by the plaintiffs, which are BS, were never checked before getting to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court doesn't do that sort of stuff. So that's really that's one thing that is clear. The other thing is it has to do. They're invoking something called the major questions doctrine, which is like basically, can the president do things, or should it that involve major questions? And it's sort of one of these. It's a made up doctrine. A doctrine sort of dignifies it. But I think your point is spot on, which is so Congress passed the Higher Education Act. Congress passed the HEROES Act. Congress, as you exactly said, it didn't just contemplate putting this provision to ensure that debt relief isn't taxable. It's in there, right? We are in a window. I think it's 5 years. Somebody should fact check me on that.
I think it's 2025 is my understanding. End of 2025. Yep.
Yeah. So from 2025 years, where you get federal debt relief and it's not taxed as income. And so, this is the thing. Congress has weighed this, and you're exactly right. They did. There was a kind of showy attempt by Republicans to pass a bill, and it did pass in both houses with some Democrat support, trying to claw back relief and block this program, and actually impose, to try to, in theory, claw back some of the relief people have already been given. So Congress has been pretty clear on this, right? That they think that relief is a legitimate thing, and that's why this court case is baseless and in bad faith and bogus, and why I think, many other people agree with me that the executive branch is fully within its rights to use one of the other legal authorities it possesses should the justices strike down this iteration of debt relief.